can't run a Range Rover on a thimble of gasoline. Look at what the building's proposing of what they're going to be delivering.
Some are just trying to get the commission, and they'll tell you things that sound fantastic and will not come to fruition, and there's nothing you can do about it.
There are a lot of promises that are not going to be in the contract, and you took everything that they said to you literally, you could lose your shirt. It's all about getting into bed with the right developer. And there are a few cases of buildings which were massively delayed. I say that because I've seen developers kick the can down the street for groundbreaking, and the variables changed from what I thought I was buying to what I got. Welcome back for another episode of the Better Decisions podcast. I am David Siddons, and I'm here today with Greg Herskowitz, who is a good friend and a very, very experienced attorney in South Florida. It is November the 6th, and this conversation is all about pre-construction contracts and everything that you need to know if you're considering buying a new, or what we call a pre-construction contract in South Florida. And it's particularly relevant because it's a little bit different to the rest of the country. So if you're in New York or California and you're watching this and you're considering making a purchase, the way we do things down here in Florida is a little bit different. So let's dive into it. Greg, thank you for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Very quickly, just outline what you do, area of expertise, how long you've done it, your pedigree, and then we're just going to go straight into the pre-construction process.
Sure. Thanks for having me, by the way.
Pleasure.
Grew up in Miami, been here my whole life, went to University of Miami Law School. Been practicing for almost 28 years. 24 of that in real estate. So what I do is essentially all real estate transactions, closings, title, represent buyers, represent sellers, residential, commercial. I've done, obviously, a lot of pre-construction buyer representations as well, which is what brought me here today.
A lot of my clients, and this is really where this conversation started, because I do a lot of pre-construction sales, and quite candidly, it needs to be navigated well. And it still surprises me that every day I see buyers come to me and they really have no idea or little idea of how it really works. And I've also had conversations with people who have met agents, bought units, and been completely blindsided. And at the end, they've called me and said, you know what, David, I went to the day of closing and suddenly all these variables changed and I literally felt sick to my stomach on the spot. I had a call last week from a girl that said exactly that to me. Got in there and the variables changed from what I thought I was buying to what I got. And I think this is very key to go through. So we're going to go through it. And again, the process here is we're going to break down some of the key clauses that we see in these pre-construction contracts. And we're going to address how we deal with them, how we explain them, and what we can do with them, because sometimes we don't have to accept them. Sometimes we can tweak them a little bit. Let's go through the overall process, first of all, just to kind of frame everything. Take us through the process of the pre-construction from a buyer coming in and buying a unit. How does it work?
Sure. Well, so number one, and most importantly, is I do appreciate someone like you who would recommend to a buyer that they hire an attorney, because typically what happens is the seller controls, their attorney does the contract, they do all the title work, they hold the escrow, they do all of that. Some agents, probably more than some, don't recommend to their clients that they hire an attorney to review the contract, manage the expectations, and so forth. So I think that's very important. As it relates to a buyer, when they come and they see something, let's say they go and they view a unit, typically, depending on where the status of the project, you either do a reservation agreement, which is just like an agreement to sign a purchase agreement, or you actually have the purchase agreement itself. And what you do is you start to negotiate. You get a contract, and you have to negotiate the terms, the price, materials, finish date, everything. And that's really what you start with. And you sign the agreement once you identify the unit you want, and then everything flows from there.
And typically, and again, reservation agreements we see with a few buildings, but a lot of them, they go straight to contract.
Correct.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but typically it's around 20% at contract. Sometimes it's a little less depending on the developer, but it's 20% at contract. Then there is a further amount of money paid at groundbreaking, which is sometimes around 10 to 15%. Then there is a further amount of money that's paid at top off.
Correct.
Another 10 to 15%. And then there's a balance at closing, which will happen after top off, sometimes typically maybe a year after top off.
Yes. So, obviously it depends on the developer and
Yes.
how efficient they are, how experienced they are at building. But yes, typically, so going back to before like the crash of the market back in 2006 or so, developers were only taking about 20% deposits.
Yeah.
When the market went, I would say crashed, they realized that they needed to start collecting more, which is why they are collecting now upwards towards 40%.
Yes.
Which it's more skin in the game for a buyer. Typically, though, what happens is in the contract, there is a completion date, right? An estimated completion date, which is obviously after the top off and the things that you just discussed. And the completion date might be anywhere from a year, depending, up to 3 years from the date you sign the contract. That would be the date that they estimate they'll be done. However, what they also do, and they build in the contract, is they give themselves an outside date as well. So usually, and I'll tell you just from experience, in paragraph 7, because I've seen these concepts.
So let's dive into it. You're going straight in. I love it.
Yeah.
Let's take out that quote that comes, and again, these contracts, and many of them are written by Greenberg Traurig. They represent a lot of the developers, so all of them are almost boilerplate contracts. But the first thing, which is the big thing that we always get into, is the delivery date of the project, when you're going to get what you think you're going to get.
Correct.
So what is the language that's in the contract right now that talks about deliverability?
So it's typically paragraph 7,
Okay.
literally, and it says completion date and then contingency. Of course, contingency is there for a reason. And what it says is subject to the provisions of this agreement, including without, and it talks about paragraph 9, which is another paragraph that talks about the completion date. Seller estimates that it will substantially complete construction of the unit in the manner specified in the agreement by approximately blank. And that date is the date that gives them, usually it's a 2 to 3 year window, is I would say normally what I see. Now that contingency it's subject to force majeure provisions. Force majeure provisions are typically provisions outside the builder's control. It could be work stoppages. It could be weather.
But it doesn't have to be, because people always think of force majeure. They think of a hurricane or a storm.
Right.
But it doesn't have to be a force of nature, the literal French translation of force majeure. It can be something that is, you said labor. It could be something else that can create a delay.
Yes, and the developer actually puts, and I'm reading verbatim from a contract that is a standard contract, the term force majeure is used in this agreement shall mean acts of God, which are what you're talking about, could be fire, severe weather, earthquake, labor disputes, whether lawful or not, work stoppages, material or labor shortages, restrictions or delays by any government or utility authority, court of law, civil riots, terrorism, war. I mean, so they give a litany of, I don't want to say excuses, but reasons, justifications why they can get past that estimated completion date, which then brings us to the other paragraph, which is paragraph 9, that says essentially that notwithstanding that estimated completion date, they give themselves an additional, could be 1 year to 2 years beyond that estimated completion date to deliver it to you.
So this is probably the biggest elephant in the room, is the delivery date of projects. And part of the conversation of delivery dates, as you put in, there's a lot of variables for the developer to deliver. But there are some telling signs. And again, this is where the rubber meets the road, where you take the contract and then you obviously look at the developer. And that's when clients will talk to me and say, all right, if I take this contractually at face value, it doesn't read very well. I went to the sales office and they said, oh, we should be done by 2027. I'm just giving you a fictional date for a fictional building. We'll be delivered by 2027. But the contract might stipulate we have until 2029, 2030 to deliver, because there's an outside date for their initial delivery, and then there's another additional date that goes beyond that. The forces that influence that, and this is less of a legal thing and more of this, the real world situation, is developers who are going to deliver on time, and what are the forces that pressure them to deliver on time. For example, one of the things I notice is the groundbreaking and who owns the land, whether they need finance to build the project, and their labor supply and other variables that come into this kind of additional terms. What do I mean by that? I'll notice that a developer, and again, I'm typecasting here, but I think this is just a good case in point. If a developer is going to come in and build a project and they, one, own the land, and number two, they are financially so well backed and so financially secure that they say, we don't need financing. The process of interest rates, and this is a current issue right now, is much less of a restriction to get things going. I say that because I've seen developers kick the can down the street for groundbreaking because the interest rates just didn't suit them. And the contract allows them this, flexibility of time to say, you know what, maybe you're going to wait a little bit longer, because if his interest rates drop by a point, my God, that is a huge difference in my construction loan.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. Look, I think just on a more broader level, I think that's the significance of working with an agent who knows Miami, knows the developers, understands who is reputable, who's been around, who does this building after building and gets things delivered on time. Miami's a big city, but it's also a small town.
Yeah.
And you certainly, there are certain developers that maybe this is their first bite at the apple.
Yeah.
Right. And some agents won't really give you that.
Well, absolutely. And that's the thing. I mean, there's the crude saying, don't shit on your own doorstep. Right. There are developers who are ingrained here. They're part of the community. They live here, whether it's David Martinetero or it's Ugo Colombo. These guys are invested in the market because they live here. They're not building because they're just rich and they have money and they have a vanity project on their mind. So it's important that if you read this, you should know, you've got to know who to get into bed with, and also look at their track record. Because, if you've done a project and you've done 10 projects before and you deliver them within 12 months of a timeline, then you're generally considered a good builder, a good developer, which is really, really key. And then obviously you look at the other parties involved, because it's like building a house. If I have a general contractor who quite honestly sucks, he's probably not going to build what I want, and he's not going to do it in the time that I want. But if you've got if you hired the right builder, and last week I had Sean Murphy from Coastal, and we talked about there's two big players, really, Coastal and Moss, and there's a few others that are around who have done some good, construction too. But these guys know what they're doing. And there are a few cases of buildings which were massively delayed, and delayed by 3 or 4 years. And there's one right now at the bottom end of Brickell that still hasn't been finished, and they started selling in 2016.
Yep.
So when you get into that, you've got to look at and think, okay, are they going to deliver to the timeline that they need to deliver?
And let me just say, that's part of the significance here of trying to negotiate, right? In the contract, there's many terms in this contract that are non-negotiable. Developers just won't agree to revising, all the terms. But you can try to negotiate the outside date, right? The completion date, the outside date, because you might go and you might talk to a sales rep for the builder who's going to say, yeah, well, we have it for December 2029, but we're going to be done in a year. Well, you can use that to your advantage in trying to get the contract revised or amended so they deliver a little bit sooner than what it states in the contract.
Yeah. We've tried having accountability with developers, and I've even had buyers come to me and say, can we bake into the contract not a consolation
penalty,
but a penalty for late delivery? How successful is that? Does that even work?
Not on the developer on the bigger scale. Maybe if you're working on a one-off developer who's just building a new construction of a home or something, but I haven't had that success here.
Yeah, and I kind of said that was a loaded question because I know we haven't, because we've done this together, and we know it's just so you guys, if you're wondering out there, hey, could I operate my pre-construction contract in the same manner as I do with my contract if I'm building a single family home? And the honest answer is no, you can't.
Yeah, and maybe a little bit of the reason behind that is because the developers typically do have, certain financial obligations, whether it's to a lender or joint venture with investors, right? And so if they give all these buyers the right to get out after a certain period of time, their whole project's going to crumble.
So let's talk about the financial obligations, because the financial obligations are a big thing, and the process of, most developers are borrowing money from the bank to build a project. Is there anything in the contracts that discusses their relationship with the lenders, with financing, with anything at all like that?
No, well, not in the contract itself. If you're talking about the developers and their relationships with their own financial, backers, so to speak, you give the deposits. They can use portions of those deposits towards the construction as well, which is important.
It's was where I was actually going with this, and it's all about the money flowing hands. When you build a house, you obviously pay often in sections. Florida is different to the rest of the country. It's different to New York, whereby in New York, I believe you cannot use, and correct me if I'm wrong, you cannot use escrowed funds for construction on a new project.
Yeah, I'm not. I don't know enough in New York what goes on there, but I know that it's what happens here, and I believe it is different than New York because I've dealt with enough New Yorkers to know that they're surprised when they read that.
So what is the contractual, or what can developers use? How much of the money that's held in escrow can they use?
It's the amount over the 10% deposit that they can use. What we typically, and that's usually a non-negotiable item because they rely on that money.
Yeah.
What you can try to do is see if they have some type of surety bond or some mechanism that provides you with protection in case they default or in case they don't meet a deadline for a closing date. If we're successful in negotiating that, they have to either deliver this unit to you by December 31 of 2028, or you can get out.
Yeah.
You want to get your money back.
Yeah. And in terms of the financial mechanism, the developers require, with a lot of the lenders, 20% in order to make that contract hard.
Correct.
How does that work? Is that detailed in the contract, or is that just a statutory process or an agreement that they have with the bank?
It's an agreement they have with the bank, but typically what it says is if they don't, the developer doesn't have, usually I think it's about 80% of the contracts, which typically means contracts with 20% deposit
hard contracts
down, contracts, then they can actually cancel the project and give the money back. I mean, they have a deadline with their lender or investors to secure hard money, contracts with hard money down.
So can you, in the contract, let's say you're early out of the gate and the developer needs 50% of the building in hard contract, well, they usually say by the time we get to 50%, that's when we can secure our lending. That's when the bank will actually lend to us. Can buyers put contracts or put dates in contracts stating that if you haven't sold by 50% by this date in order to get your financing, I can get my deposit back?
You can try. Typically the developer already has that in the contract. They have their own deadline. So they would provide that. But you can try to negotiate. I will say that negotiating the terms of this contract also often depends on who the developer is. I mean, I've dealt with, there's Greenberg Traurig that represents the developers, a lot of them.
Yes.
And I have a great working relationship with them, and they're very good at what they do. But trying to negotiate terms really depends on who their client is.
Yeah.
There are certain clients that will agree to certain negotiable terms, and certain clients they have that won't.
It also comes down to leverage. So we've actually been on a call with Greenberg Traurig, you, me, and a Greenberg Traurig attorney. You've had a good relationship with that attorney. I've represented multitude of buyers for one project, more than one, more than half a dozen. And the leverage there is, look, we represent a number of clients here. We're going to bake in this addendum into all of those contracts. We want to make sure that we give them something more than what they're otherwise getting. And we did. We managed to negotiate, I want to say somewhere was between 6 and 12 points. And we got the majority of what we wanted baked into the contract, which was wonderful. At the same time, there's always asks, there's always a reach. And I think it's important to know that sometimes if you don't get that satisfaction on that point, it doesn't mean that you should just walk away. It's just expected that there is certain things that I think you can highlight the requirements that are needed to hold people to contracts. Otherwise, the whole kind of thing collapses. And you alluded to that just off camera before we started.
Correct.
Well, go into that a little bit if you can.
I mean, some of that is obviously delivery of deposits.
Yes.
That's the first and most important thing. If you don't want, say, for example, client says, well, I only want to give 5 or 10%. and then I'll give X amount during, groundbreaking and X amount during top off, they won't agree to it because they have an agreement with their own investor. That's number one. Number two would be completion date. They're not going to let you back out too early, right? I mean, I think that, and some of this is going to depend on their client and how confident their client is that they're going to deliver. There are certain things, for example, they're not going to tie it to, which I want to go back and talk about, they're not going to tie it to any contingency on financing for the buyer.
Yep.
The buyer, and it's very important to understand, and what I try to tell all buyers is, you're signing a contract today on November 6, 2024. If your closing is going to be December 31st of 2027, okay, things might change. Your financial status might change. The market might change. What's not going to change is that you're obligated to close all cash.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're precluded from getting financing. I have plenty of buyers that do secure financing, which leads me to one other point. But so you want to try to negotiate with, if you're a buyer and you want to get financing. Let's say, I could pay cash, but I'd like to, if rates are favorable in 3 years or whatever, there's a 10-day notice to close that the developer gives you. Well, we want to try to extend that notice to close to 30 days or 45 days. So when you're running up towards, okay, you're getting correspondence from the developer and you know that they're about to send a notice to close, that's when you engage your lender and you have that lead time to close with finance.
So let's take that piece out of the contract. Can you reference that piece in the contract so we can actually go into it? Because that's a really good point. And I've got a number of clients who come in and say, what happens if I'm traveling? What happens if I'm out of the country? What happens if I'm trying to sort out my financing because I have to liquidate assets? A lot of people, they don't just have the money sitting in a bank account. They've got it working for them.
Correct.
And that's, whether it's in the stock markets with bonds or other systems, they can't just, sell within a 5 or 10 day period. And sometimes if they do, there's a penalty for doing so.
Correct.
So having that flexibility is going to be important.
Well, first I'll just say, it says there's always a paragraph that says in the developer contract that says, how does the buyer pay? And it says, buyer understands and agrees that the buyer will be obligated to pay all cash at closing, and this agreement is not contingent or conditioned upon buyer obtaining financing. So that's that. I mean, it says that, and it goes on in that paragraph, but it talks about that. Then it talks about, in another portion of the paragraph, it talks about the notice to close, and it basically says, I can't find it right now, but it says that essentially when they send you a 10-day notice to close, you then now have 10 days to close on that transaction. So what we do is we have them change it, and I don't meet with a lot of resistance on this, of at least trying to get 30 days. We always ask for more. Some lenders give you 45, some will give you 30, and then if you need it, another 15.
Yeah, for the most part, the good developers, the big ones I know, they've never holding guns to someone's head. They want to close on the unit.
Correct.
And when I've dealt with this and they said, it was 10 days, and their contract said 10 days, but they said, look, I've got to move some things around. I'm traveling. It's got this. I've got, there are a million different things can happen. Health issues, finance situations, loans, liquidation of capital, whatever it might be. And this obviously is not something that you can do quickly. Typically, the people who are closing are getting good advance notice. I'm working closely with my buyers to tell them, hey, you're going to be closing. I got a letter from the developer who says that in 30 days we're going to start closings. And that's telling you, get your ducks in a row, get everything organized.
Well, it's interesting because, and I have probably 5 to 10 open files now that are just buyer representations for pre-construction. And it's like, hurry up and then wait, and hurry up and then wait. The developers' representatives will send something saying, just letting you know, in about 30 days, we expect to get a temporary certificate of occupancy, which we can talk about. And then 30 days later or 25 days later, they send something, say, okay, not just yet, maybe give us another 30 days. So you at least get that lead time. They don't want to set people up for default, right? Yeah. They want to give people that notice.
And when it comes to, so this is like that natural progression, you go through it, you go to close. And the next part that I want to cut into, which is I think really, really key, and I'm seeing this right now, is are you closing on the unit and it's ready not just for you to close and the developer to close, but is it ready for occupation? Is not the building just being livable? And I'm talking about the TCO and the CO conversation. Sure. The TCO says it's safe to live in the unit, but the pool might not be open, the gym might not be open, and a whole lot of amenities may not be operational in the building. And so the quality of living in that building may not be what you felt it might be like. And that's something that, we've discussed with clients to say, all right, we've baked these additions into contracts saying a number of amenities need to be functional and operational for us to be closing.
Right. And some of that, again, depends on the developer you're dealing with and what they will agree to. But a TCO is a temporary certificate of occupancy.
Yes.
A CO is a certificate of occupancy. And so we call it TCO or CO. The developer will always have in the contract that they close with the TCO, because the fact of the matter is they're not going to have a CO of the entire building as they start to close.
Yeah.
They typically will close based on the floors, right? So if the first residence is on floor 7, they'll start to work on getting the TCOs on those units, meaning that the city has inspected and deemed those units safe for people to live in. Okay. It doesn't mean they're going to be in perfect condition, and we can talk about that, but that's what it means. So a TCO is what you're going to close on. Now, can you also bake into the contract that the amenities have to be open for the people living in the units? And it's a mixed bag. It depends who you're dealing with. For example, I have one right now, a client of mine who's buying a condo, but it's going to be in a hotel program.
Yeah.
Okay. So my client says, why would I close if the hotel program's not running yet? If the amenities aren't working, it's not going to be rented out. So we're now trying to negotiate that the hotel has to be operable and the amenities have to be operable, and we're waiting to hear back. Yeah. But yes, I mean, but you're always going to close with a TCO in those buildings, not with a CO.
And I think it's worth just, again, real-world application, because, again, we have what's in the contract, and then we have the real-world situation as it happens. There are pros and cons to closing early and closing towards the end of the project. For closing early, one of the things, and again, you can, let me know where this is in the contract, is those who close early very often get to choose the parking spaces that they want early. And for some buyers, that's really, really important. And then on top of that, there are also those who might want to do what we call a simultaneous closing, because I have a lot of clients who are also opportunistic investors. I deal with a lot of pre-construction projects. As you know, I've reviewed over 41 independent reviews of new construction projects through South Florida, and I've been selling it for nearly 20 years. So I like to think I know probably more about the new condo market than anybody else, because I not only have dealt with it, but I study it and I study the numbers and I study the kind of trajectory of the market. But with clients, I also have those who, when I tell them really early of a new project that's coming out, like day 1, day 2, day 3, usually within the first 7 days, those guys, I get a lot of investors coming in. And they like to do a simultaneous closing. We know you can't flip the contracts. That's been done away with. Correct. So, I guess maybe might as well say it. Where in the contract does it stipulates in all these contracts now, there can be no flipping of contracts.
Well, yeah, they don't allow.
It's a Florida law,
right?
Isn't it?
Well, it's more contracted. So the contract says.
Oh, it's not. I thought it was a law now that they'd passed through.
No, the contract says that they won't permit. Not only do they not permit it to be flipped, meaning and for purposes of the audience, and what flip means is I have a contract to buy a condominium.
Yep.
And before I close, I assign it to you.
Yes.
And you're then going to just take it over. They don't allow that. And also what they don't allow is they don't allow agents for me as the buyer to market that property for sale until we close. So generally what happens on these is you can get someone else who's going to buy it simultaneously. That's
a little bit more nuanced, but
it's more nuanced.
That kind of means they're closing within usually 24 hours of when you close.
That is correct. And it's because also the developers want to control the prices. You know what I mean?
They do. And that gets an interesting point because it's slightly off topic. It's all within the topic. The price, and I've seen this with developers, the price when you see what they close on, and I don't know if this is still happening, but they will give a credit to a buyer rather than seeing a cannibalization of their numbers. So if you go through the process and you see what was sold, if they truly represented what they sold units for, the guy who bought 6 months after the first guy who bought is going to go up in arms and go, well, that guy bought at $5 million and I'm paying 5.8. I want to pay what that guy paid. So what the developers I see them doing is they say, okay, we're going to do the contracts all that they look around the same dollar per square foot, but we're going to give a credit at closing from the developer to obviously bring your number, but down to the number that we agreed upon.
Correct. Yeah, they're not going to reduce the purchase price. They will absolutely give a credit.
Yeah.
Which also goes to in these contracts, there's something called a developer fee.
It's a whole other thing. So that goes. So the developer fee I want to come to, but before then, I was going to go through the pros and cons of selling early and selling late. So.
Okay,
you've got choosing the parking spaces early. You've got the ability to maybe if there's a demand for that product and you're one of the early closers, there may be a big hot demand for that unit. And if you wait to the end, there may be a lot more product that comes available within the building, and that might not work to your favor. On the flip side, if you wait to the end, then everything is done, the building's more operational, and then you're getting more in that move-in ready, everything's, the engine's running really well scenario.
Yeah, and I think some of that depends. Well, first of all, if you get in early, you'll probably get a better price typically, right? You know that more than I do, but
yeah.
If you sign something,
well, I mean when you close early,
okay.
When you close,
when you close early,
early, of course.
but the seller is going to control the closing, so it depends on what floor and their schedule of closings. But if you close early, yes, you will generally get a better parking space.
Yeah.
What you and I have tried together, is to try to negotiate what parking spaces. They typically, developer, unless it's a really high-priced unit, is going to be very reluctant to let you pick your parking spaces. They'll tell you close early, we'll give you the spaces. What you and I both collectively were able to do for a mutual client is at least identify where that parking space will be. It'll be near the elevators, on the floor, same floor as the unit, right? And we put that into an amendment of the contract.
Yeah.
So now we've protected our client. But yeah, I mean, there are benefits to closing early. Look, if you're also someone that you want to rent it out, right? If you close early and all the amenities aren't there, you might have to discount the lease.
Yes.
Right? The lease price for a little bit. So it really depends.
Yeah. It's all, and I mean, I guess investors, it's all kind of cash flow. So you've got to look at this. Okay. Yeah. So let's go back into the last point you just raised that I kind of cut you off on. Okay. Let's go into that.
The developer fee?
Let's go into the developer fee. Yeah. The developer fee is, again, misunderstood, and people go, "Oh, there's a developer fee. I didn't know."
Developer fees can be, quite costly too. Anywhere from, I've seen them at 1.25% of the purchase price up to 1.75% of the purchase price.
Okay, so in the contract, where do we see the developer fee? Where is that stipulated? So just so if you boys and girls watching this and you want to looking at going away contract.
Actually, it's typically listed in the purchase price, which would be in pages 2 and 3.
So right at the beginning.
2C talks about a developer fee. So it then also is listed further in the contract where it talks about who pays what costs.
And there are costs in here that I think need to be detailed. So when you buy a property, there's several things to unpack. You've got your purchase price. Then when you close, there is a several months HOA fees that need to be taken into the pot, so to speak, to build the reserves that the building needs.
It's called a capital contribution.
There you go.
So what the developer typically has is they'll collect from you the 1 month of the amount. So if we close today, November 6th, they'll collect November, and then you'll also pay a 2-month capital contribution. That 2-month capital contribution doesn't pay for you December and January. The 2-month capital contribution, and this is required by law, goes into a reserve. And when the developer ultimately turns over the entire condominium project to the unit owners, who ultimately run the association, all of those reserves are provided to them so they have at least a nice, healthy balance to start as the building might need maintenance and things like that. Yeah. That used to not be the case. And imagine all the owners get the building turned over to them and there's no money in reserve.
Well, this is one of the things that has now been implemented, which is a good thing. I believe it's a good thing.
Very good thing, agreed.
Now you've got the buildings where it's a minimum requirement that they have 10% per year accruing on the reservation, on the pots, to cover costs down the line, which obviously has meant HOA fees have gone up a little bit, but that's actually a good insurance policy for the owners, and obviously it's part of the HOA. The developer fee, going back into that. So you've got your capital contribution, you've got your developer fee. On a normal transaction, a normal purchase for a home or a condo, if you look at it, you have your attorney's fee, you have your stamp duty and title. What is the developer fee? Is it a fee on top of that, or it's something different?
So
I know the answer, but
right. The developer fee, let's just call it 1.75% of the purchase
Let's do that.
price, okay? The developer will typically pay for the owner's title insurance premium, which depending the way title insurance rates work, it's directly commensurate with the purchase price. The state of Florida has what's called a promulgated rate schedule, but it's could be in the thousands of dollars. And then they also will pay the transfer tax or the documentary stamps on the deed, which is what the formula is $6 per thousand, right? So they will pay for those two things. They'll pay for the recording of the deed. Anything over and above the delta that's left after that's paid by the seller is their administrative cost. That comes out of the developer fee. So if the developer fee is 1.75% of $1 million, right? Or just easy numbers, they'll pay for the doc stamps, the title insurance, any balance over that they keep. Now, what really depends on the developer is, can we negotiate that developer?
Yes, and this is where we try to, again, sharing this so you can be better armed. The developers, in my understanding, when they run all their numbers, they bake their developer fee into the figure. So the price that you're paying has them consciously aware that if you close on a house or a condo, a normal, let's say, the stamp duty, title, and attorney's fees might accrue to maybe around 1%, maybe 1.25% at the most, but it's not 1.75%. So there's a little bit of a half a point bump here. And again, I know they might not like to hear this, but there is a little bit of extra money that they're making in this process. And that's where typically with my clients, I've become very good at squeezing that down. Because in my mind, it's a little bit like I'm not out in the process to see if I can give free. I want to protect my clients from paying things that aren't necessarily part of the real cost process.
Right.
So we go through this, we chip this down a little bit, we kind of negotiate back and forth, and obviously a lot of it comes down into the numbers. And then we get into the process of looking at what's the next thing to be aware of once you work through, let's say, the finances.
Right. Well, going back real quick to developer fee, just to give you an example, we've been able to negotiate, for example, on a deal where the developer fee will be the total aggregate cost of the title insurance, the doc stamps, and the recording of the deed. I've had a developer agree to that.
Yeah.
I've also had a developer say, I'm not budging off the 1.75. What, like you said before about the purchase price, and they're aware and cognizant that they don't want the purchase price to be affected, or same thing, they don't want there to be a developer fee affected. If they agree to it, often they'll charge you, but they'll give you a credit back as well, so it doesn't look like they've given in.
Yeah. And then there's the process of the actual product. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. I like to think so. When you're getting into the process and you buy a unit, and are you going to get what you think you're going to get? And this is really what it comes down to. When you're buying pre-construction, you're looking at the building. All the renderings look amazing. The whole package that you're being sold to by the team in-house. The key is deciphering if you're going to get what you think you're going to get.
Yeah. Well, so the way the developer has it is they do attach as exhibits the renderings, the plans, not just for your specific unit, but for the lobby, the common areas, and so forth. But it also does give them the ability to make changes as are required, either by materials being available or
and that's super important. So if you go right back to the beginning, right? So we just were discussing what it was like when you're at closing. But if you go right back to the beginning of the process, where you're sitting down and you're sitting in the sales office and you decide you want a unit,
right?
And we negotiate the price, we negotiate a lot of other things, and you go, all right, this is great, this is what I want. Sitting down and then figuring out, are you going to get what you think you're going to get? The first thing is, once you sign and you send your deposit, they will send you the condo docs, right? The condo docs explain the condo docs exactly what they are and what's involved in.
So the condominium documents are pretty boilerplate statutory nature, and they're just that you have to file basically with the county and the state that you're declaring this a condominium by statute. Most of what's in that is I mean, it'll put you to sleep, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
and it's designed to probably put you to sleep.
yes, but right, don't read it at night in bed. But what it will also provide is a proposed budget. It'll, you'll have the plans. They'll have all these things, the specs. They'll also give you what's called frequently asked questions, rules and regulations, all these things for you to review. Here, I just want to actually bring up one more thing in the contract is if you sign a contract, a developer contract, if I sign the contract today on November 6th, I have an automatic 15-day right to cancel, avoidability period. It's in every contract, and get my money back. And here's a mistake that some people make is it's not 15, it's 15 calendar days. So if it lands on a Saturday on the 15th day, that's your date to cancel. It is not it is not the date that this developer returns the contract back to you. It's the date you sign it. So if I dated it today, November 6th, you as my agent, David, sent it to the representative for the builder, and it took 5 days or 6 days for us to get it back signed. I now only have 9 or 10 days left of that 15-day period, but you do have that right to cancel.
And when do they send you the condo docs?
They typically will try to give that to you right away because that's that you can't cancel without two things: the condo docs and the 15-day. The 15 days won't start until that.
So one of the things that I talk about with clients is even before we go into the contract is to say, all right, so we're going to sign here, but I want 15 days from the moment that I get the condo docs, from when you sign and you give me the condo docs. Because if you waste 5 days and I've only got 10 left,
right,
then maybe that's not enough time. So I want that
that's in
time.
there, right? I mean, and you're right to bring that up, but typically until you have those condo docs, clock doesn't.
And here's when the condo docs to me get interesting, right? You're right; they're boring as hell. They send you to sleep. But here's where I've picked up on condo docs over the years. And this is, thank God, why, I say to my clients, this is a huge purchase. Get some representation, get some protection. And I throw over, and God bless you, you put up with this crap from me all the time. I send you the condo docs. I'm like, can you look at these? And there's several things that I like to unpack with the condo docs. And this is just putting it out there. The architectural plans that they give you in the sales office, several things. Number one, the city recorded square footages that you will get once you close on your unit and you take possession of it. And if you come to resell it, the square footage that will be advertised on the MLS is not the same as the architectural marketing plans that they give you. I'm going to say that again because it's really, really important. And I see this problem all the time. The plans that they give you in the sales office, the square footage that they give you for the interior is not going to be the same as the recorded square footage that you're going to get in the tax roll and you're going to see on resales. So if you're analyzing, or if you're asking me to analyze the value of that unit against comparables within the market, I cannot compare apples to oranges by using the architectural floor plans that they've given me, or the marketing floor plans they've given me, compared to the resale plans that I'm seeing in other buildings, because they are different. And there's usually around a 15% variance because they measure from middle of the wall to middle of the wall, and there's a few other little things that they do that means that the square footage does shrink by the time you actually walk into the unit. Sometimes the variances can be bigger. I've seen many clients, they've walked into a unit that, again, I'm thankful to say that I've never once had a client come to me and say, I really wasn't happy with the unit that you sold me, David. Every time everyone's been happy, they've made money, and it's been a good result. But I've had many calls from people who say, I walked into a unit and it just didn't feel like what I thought it was going to feel like. Everything felt smaller. And then they measured it and they're like, that's because it is smaller. And if you've got a smaller unit, every square foot counts. Every square foot counts. Closets count, living room counts, bedroom counts. This all matters. Then the worst case scenario is when they change the plans. And this is about trusting the developer. I've had people come to me with developers and they've said, I bought this unit. And suddenly I got into my unit and there was a column in my unit that wasn't there on the plans. Like there was a flipping huge concrete column blocking my view. And that was not on the marketing plans that they gave me. How does that happen?
It happens because the contract gives the developer the right to make these changes if it's required for the city. For example, if that's a load bearing or some type of structural column that needs to be there, then they have the right to put it there.
So in that case, this is where I would go to a developer and say, I want to make sure that if my client's buying this unit on these plans, there can be no columns being added in here. And if they do, you have to notify them.
Yeah.
And then they have a right to make a decision on that. Because this is a material, it's like me hiring a GC to build my house and suddenly he sticks a column right through my kitchen.
Right.
I'm like, that wasn't on the plans. I didn't agree you to do that. And this is where I think it becomes important to get into bed with the right developers. Because the good guys, the main developers, they know what they're doing. They don't misrepresent themselves. They also don't misrepresent view corridors as well. There's a lot of stuff on the marketing that shows these buildings that stand in isolation from everything around them. And everything looks amazing. It's almost like, is this a house in Miami or is this in like, I don't know, it looks like it's in California somewhere. It's like palm trees everywhere and there's nothing around.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, and I'm looking, but I can't find. But there is so there's you get essentially an implied warranty by the kind of.
And we can take a pause if you want because we can edit the hell out of this. So if you want to find it for a second, maybe it's worth finding because I think it's maybe worth doing. These are the things that, like, I think help.
Yeah. So what we were talking about is what do you expect to receive?
Yeah.
Right? And there's a clause in the contract, and in this particular contract I'm looking at, which is a contract from Greenberg, which is the law firm representing the developers. In 29D, it talks about the warranties, and that there's an implied warranty, right? For a condominium act, usually it's about 3 years.
Yes.
There's no expressed warranty. They're not going to give you additional warranties, okay? Yeah. But what the developer talks about is that, listen, and I'm going to read to you, because the condominium is in an active urban environment and is intended to include operations that will likely attract a broad and diverse base from among the public, the buyer hereby agrees that any and all activities typical of such urban environment in such operations, including any associated noise, traffic congestion, other inconveniences, shall not be deemed a nuisance. They also say that the buyer is to understand and agree that they might be affected by noise, by other buildings, by other projects that are under construction, in your view, et cetera. So they carve that out of any warranty.
Yeah. Which is why the agent, like myself, I do my due diligence. I go with my team there. I do a number of things. I send drones up to look at the views. I also research and understand the lots around the building because, especially right now more than ever, whether in the urban core is a really good example, there's always a new building coming up. There's always something. And if there's an empty lot of land or if there's an old building, there's a very good chance it's going to get knocked down. And now more than ever, with the older buildings and the changing of laws, it's become much easier. The ability to, purchase some of these properties is going to become a much more recognized and I think a regular situation moving forward. So be very cognizant because whether they are going to renovate the building and you're going to hear a jackhammer going on every single day for the next 5 years next to you, or you're going to have a building right up in front of you, that's not within the contract. That's not something that you can negotiate or allow you to cancel.
Correct.
Whatever they do, you're going to have to do your due diligence. This is a caveat emptor, buyer beware situation.
It is. And even to take that in a different level is your own particular unit you're buying,
yes.
Okay? You're going to go and walk into that unit. And I always tell the clients, and this isn't necessarily, it's more managing expectations. Some of it is legal advice. Some of it is just practical advice. You're going to walk into that unit. You have the right to do what's called a walkthrough prior to closing.
Yes.
You should bring an inspector. People ask me 100% because you yourself are not going to have the same eye that the inspector is going to have. You're not going to be able to look at certain things. There are no escrows. When you do your punch list and you find, and they have the TCO, and they tell you you have to close, and they schedule the walkthrough maybe the day before the closing, you put together a punch list. That developer then has the right to address that punch list after closing.
Yeah.
And no money is to be escrowed. Okay. Now, if you're buying the $10 or $15 or $20 million unit, you might be able to negotiate that. But if you're buying a $4 million unit or whatever it is, some of it is leverage.
And in terms of the timeliness of them addressing the what I call the blue tape punch list, I usually go into these units with clients armed with a roll of blue tape, And very often not the individual walking through the building who works for the developer is already armed with that and their little, their iPad now rather than a clipboard. And we're taping stuff like crazy. And then they will say, how long will it take for this to be fixed? One of the things that we may be able to discuss on contracts is you have a timeliness to this. You can't take 6 months to remedy these situations, because if I want to sell that unit, I don't want to have to be in a position that if I then sell it to another individual, that they're not going to have any recourse. Very often than not, even though it may not be in the contract, I often find that developers will say, all right, if it's sold, we will honor the punch list items, but they're not contractually obliged to, I believe.
Correct. They're not contractually, but yes, you can. And I've been successful in negotiating that as well. Look, it's supposed to be within a reasonable period of time. The problem is, and you're right to do it, but even if you try to say you have to do it within 60 days, it does give them a little more heightened awareness that they need to get it done, but there's really no teeth to it. It's hard because they're not generally going to agree to money. The other thing that you have to be aware of when you're buying the unit is if your plan is to bring in a designer and to do a bunch of work, you can't technically do work where the punch list items are that have to be repaired, or you waive that punch list.
Yes.
That's developer's obligation to repair the punch list items. So those are other things to navigate through that you have to work out ahead of time.
Yeah. Quality of materials. And again, the interior design aspect, as you know, is pretty close to my heart because my wife owns Design Solutions, a big interior design firm, and she spends a lot of time finishing out these units once they've been closed on with developers, and works very, very closely with the developers to make sure that she can get the elevator, she can get into the unit, she can get the work done. The actual deliverability of the materials from the developer, the kitchen, the bathrooms, what they say they're going to do. One thing I would give as a caveat, and then again, this is more of a practical, this is a combination of what I call practical and legal advice, because there's two sides to it. Practically, when you get into your unit, be aware that often the renderings that they give you sometimes for what your unit will look like is, and I love this term, inspiration. Right. This is inspiration, so you can be inspired for what your unit could look like. But if you take it literally, you may be disappointed, because often on the renderings they will show drop lighting, they will show blinds and blackouts and other things in there, and there's a lot of subtleties to it. Does your unit have wiring for low voltage for your blinds and blackouts, or are you going to have to use batteries? Are you going to have to run cables across? What are you going to have to do? Does the operational element of the unit match? Because engineering, these are living, breathing, moving things. And of course, airflow with ACs and a lot of other variables that you might not think of are all part of the equation for your unit. And understanding when you come in during an inspection, we don't just look at the stuff. I'll look at the airflow. Is the AC running as it should? Is the temperature in one part of the unit the same as other? The bigger the unit, the more complicated the engineering. And this is something that, again, you've got to understand that once you get into the purchase, you do your punch list items and you close. I won't say you're on your own, but just like you would if you bought any unit, anywhere, you bought a house, you bought a condo from someone else. If you call the guy that you bought the condo from 6 months later and says, I'm not getting good airflow into the back bedroom, he'll be like, well, tough shit.
Right.
You did your inspection, you didn't claim any problems there, you went ahead, so, you got to go ahead with it.
Yeah, and I've dealt with, whether it's on a single family home with a walkthrough or something in a pre-construction where you're finally closing, generally the things that come up are the things that walk through, right? Or afterwards you didn't realize about something, which is very important. And that leads me back to where we want to have a sufficient notice to close, because what I tell people, buyers, are you want to make sure you're there at the walkthrough. Yes. You could have an amazing agent who knows what to look for and so forth, but you're the one living there. And you want to have the ability to attend that walkthrough with your agent.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, you're the one that, it's whatever you're particular about. Yeah. The other thing, going back to, and you talked about whether if you could, flip it or, sell it simultaneously or a week later. The other thing is some people go into this knowing that they want to lease it out, yes. Right? It's going to be an investment.
For sure.
The condominium documents and the frequently asked questions, which are attached to those, will give you what restrictions there are already contained in that declaration. It's very important to look at that, because if you want to buy it and you want to do a short-term rental, the couple days here, couple days there, a lot of the The buildings don't allow that. They might not allow anything less than 6 months, and you can't lease it out more than twice a year.
Yeah.
So these are things also you have to be aware of.
And the path to hell is paved with good intention. There's a lot of good intention that comes out, but the reality is that sometimes it goes awry, and it usually goes awry because people aren't paying attention, because they don't hire people like you or me to do their due diligence. They hire someone who just wants to make money, sell them a unit, move on, and then okay, now it's your problem. But there is things within the condo docs. Again, you've got to be aware of what's being delivered. So there's two things that I want to kind of get into. One, the materials being used in the unit and the building, of what they say they're going to do to what they are going to do, and the numbers that they're giving you for the operation of the building, in terms of the financials and what can happen there.
So first is materials. The more specific you can be, what I tell people is sometimes if there are several people looking at one particular unit, I would sign the contract and use that 15-day period to come up with an amendment of terms.
Yes.
Okay, that's number one. You'll get a good feeling, a good sense either from the agent represent the developer, or if they're using you, for example, you'll know if there's anyone else who's chomping at the bit to try to sign a contract for that unit. Is it a high unit?
Sometimes we just want to take it off the table so we can kick the tires.
Right. And you do want to try to have a detailed materials list for the unit specifically.
Yes.
And you want to say that if they can't use this, then maybe they have to use something of equal to or greater quality. Maybe, they have to show it to the buyer first. I mean, there's different language that you can provide, but just the contract itself, if you don't have anything else in there, if the developer can say, hey, we tried to use this, but we couldn't.
Yeah. We tried marble, but we got porcelain. Sorry.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, look, and you can't you can't have such a disparity in quality or appearance,
Sure.
but look, there might be something that is there's not such a big difference to a reasonable person, but to you, it might be, and you might not have an argument unless you have something in an amendment to the contract.
And I do get a lot of clients who, especially at the high end, the customer level, they say, you know what, I don't like this kitchen, I don't like this bathroom, I want the developer to deliver them without those things. Unfortunately, there's a big issue with that because they can't get their TCO, or they're going to have to start making major, submissions to the city, permit submissions for that. And so I always say, look, that's really a path you just can't really go down. You're not going to be able to deal with getting a developer to agree not to put the kitchen in because you want to save $120,000, or you don't put on the doors because I'm going to rip them one anyway.
Correct.
Just accept the fact that you're going to have to remove those doors. They won't get the TCO. They're not going to draw. Imagine doing that for 300 units.
Yeah.
Re-permit process. Oh, it'd be horrible.
Agreed.
But there are some things that, and again, I wanted to bring up, what ability within the contract does a developer have for value engineering?
What do you mean?
What scope do they have for, the big conversation that we have is, can this developer cut corners?
Well, they can't just cut corners because they want to cut corners to make more money. I mean, what the contract basically says is they can make changes if it's reasonable and practical. For example, if the city requires them to make the changes, right? And that has to do with, you talk about square footage too. They might deliver the project and it might have a different square footage in the unit. It might just be, a nominal amount of square footage, but they had to do it because they were required to change the plans based on what the city told them.
Yeah.
Same thing for materials. If the materials are not available, they can actually go to different materials. If there's some issue with, shortages in materials, they can go and use other materials. But if they just want to cut corners without any reasonable justification, they're not permitted to do that.
The negotiability that I often find is, again, as you would expect, when I've had clients who've bought big units. I've got some buildings. I remember a unit that I sold back, 87 Park. It was a half-floor unit, stunning unit. We negotiated that with the developer very early, and there was a lot of changes, and we brought in the building architect and the engineers to sit down with us and kind of rejig this apartment. When you start combining units, and again, especially as we live into a world now where we see a lot of owners wanting bigger real estate. Vertical living is now the term that's being used because houses have got expensive and condos are becoming more desirable. There's a whole podcast series of that I get into, and there's obviously a movement in that direction, which does lead to people who want bigger units, combining units. when we get into combinations, and this is very kind of like very niche, but I think it's worth mentioning, that requires sophistication as well, because now you're not dealing with a floor plan that maybe currently exists. It's a whole new thing. How do you navigate that?
I mean, you have to navigate that with your own professionals and the professionals that represent the developer, in my opinion, and you got to put together a comprehensive amendment to the contract.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the only way, because the developer is going to say, well, if they can do that, it might cause further delay. This is the only way we can do it, or we'll try it this way, but if the city requires it to do a different way, then we're going to have to go that route. And you have to protect yourself with doing an amendment to the contract.
You have to be aware, when I say this, you have to be aware, not just think, I just have to break a wall. It's just drywall. It's never that easy. There's a lot of engineering that goes into units requiring, like the AC duct system, how that's then going to operate when it becomes 2 units.
So all units are tied to each other with all the engineering and the AC ducts and the plumbing and everything else. So yeah, it's much more complicated.
Yeah, and there's that in smaller buildings, it's obviously a little bit easier. In big buildings, it's more complicated. But
and if you're going to pay it, the developer will typically try to work with you. I mean,
I found that. And again, it's a case having, when I bring a client who's a really strong client and it's like, here's their financials, it's obviously much easier to make things happen. One of the things we kind of skipped over, but I wanted to come around to because it just pops into my head, is the payment schedule. We've successfully negotiated payment schedules, a little bit different to sometimes the norm, where we've had a few situations where we've kind of backloaded the payments rather than the groundbreaking. We've just gone straight into top off, so that client has more agility with their finances and that money's working longer for them before it gets applied. This is just something that there are things that are harder to deal with in a contract, but there are other things that we absolutely have had success with. But that requires a good relationship with the attorneys and the developer.
100%. I mean, we were able to do it where we still couldn't really tinker much with the 20%. I think we got it extended a little bit.
We got that
extended like 60 days or something. But yes, we basically backloaded on the top off and we put less down on the groundbreaking, which they were okay with.
Yeah.
If I recall, that was what happened.
Absolutely.
But I mean, and again, that depends on the developer. It depends on the agent's relationship with the developer, right? I mean, if it's an agent that is obviously very, just like we say, you got to work with a reputable developer. Well, you need to work with a reputable agent too.
Yeah. You need to work with an agent that has a reputation, knows the developers, understands the floor plans, understands how it flows, does their due diligence, works hard enough to dig into this, and where applicable and where possible, and not, this isn't so common, but thank goodness I like to have really good relationships with the developers. I have direct line of communications to a lot of the main developers, not the salespeople. I'm talking about the developer themselves, the head office guy, the decision maker who signs off at the end of the day. And those relationships are really valuable because, I represent a very large number of buyers, and also my media exposure on new construction is to be reckoned with. There's a lot of information I put out there. So again, if sometimes I say if you're not getting anywhere, you just maybe need somebody with bigger teeth.
And by the way, it's also like you and I experience with particular attorneys. If you have a good rapport and relationship with the attorneys, and you're not a jerk to them, and you're not confrontational, and you understand there's a give and take, you can jump into those issues ahead of time to protect the client and work with them. I think that's important.
No one wants to get in bed with a meanie. I mean, it's like whether you're the buyer or you're the developer. Even a developer doesn't want to get into relationships with people who can be a pain. They just want people who are going to, appreciate the project, and they're not going to cause them unnecessary problems.
Yep.
I'm wondering if there's anything else as we've been through it. So we've kind of started to go into, obviously the product itself, the deliverability, the quality of the materials, the building itself as it pertains to how the whole building will be delivered. Promises not just within the unit, but outside of the unit and in the building itself. So I'll give you a case in point. The HOA fees, right? HOA fees are, just to be clear, when they give you the HOA fees, they are estimations of what the homeowners association fees will be. It is taken from, what's taken from? You tell us, tell us where this comes from.
They have a proposed budget.
Okay.
right? They're required to come up with a proposed budget, the operating expenses.
Yes.
And what happens is the operating expenses, let's just say that they estimate that it's $3 million a year to operate a project, right? Every single unit owner has a percentage ownership of the association, right? You're essentially, when the developer turns it over to the unit owners, the entire association, every unit is a part of the association. So you might have 3%, right? So they do that based on what is it going to require to operate the building, how much money is it going to take, and then what is that unit's proportionate share. So that's why if you have a bigger unit, you pay more association.
So is it done off the square footage of the unit, or is it just proportioned?
It's square footage of the unit. Then also everybody has a proportionate share of what's called the common elements, which is the lobby, the pool, the gym, the hotel, whatever's there.
So I'm going to throw something out there. A unit with a really, really big terrace, a unit with an extra high ceiling, does the HOA fee change because of, I know the answer, but I want them to figure it out. If you have a really big terrace to another unit that has a smaller terrace, but the interior sizes are exactly the same, will the HOA fees be different?
Typically, the terraces are owned by the association, right? Not by the unit owner. So generally, it's a square footage of the four walls.
Yes. And that's why units with big terraces are better to often buy, also because they're nicer, they're more operational. But financially speaking, there's less carry on them because you've got square footage exteriorly, but you're not technically paying for it.
Correct.
And the volume of the unit as well, it's based off the flat square footage of the floor. It's not based off the cubic square feet.
Correct.
It's not a commercial calculation.
That is correct.
So residentially, you're working off the floor. So if you have a double height, let's say you take a 2,000 square foot unit and you've got a double height, you've got an 18-foot ceiling, and then you've got a 2,000 square foot terrace, and your neighbor next to you has a same floor plan but has 10-foot ceilings and 1,000 square foot terrace, you guys could be paying exactly the same HOA fees.
Correct. It's livable square footage, which you're not sleeping, because you have more room. You're not floating in air.
Yeah.
I mean, but yes, so that is obviously an advantage if you can get a unit like that.
Yeah. So that's, to me, is part of the identification of how you understand that number. Now, that's how you do it. Now, here's where it gets really kind of interesting. When you get into buildings, their estimated costs, we have seen a number of buildings where they've estimated an HOA fee at, I don't know, let's say $1.50.
Right.
And then within a year, it's $2.50. Or you come to closing, and this happened last week with a lady who said, I bought a unit 4 years ago, and I went to close on it. And at the time, my HOA fee was told to me, a small unit, was going to be $800. The unit was, I think it was about a 750 or an 800 square foot unit. And she said, my HOA fees had been calculated at $800 a month. I'm like, that's $1 a square foot. That's really low. That's like weirdly low. She goes, yeah. I went to the closing table and my HOA fee, when I saw it on the document, said $2,000 a month. And I was like, I feel sick. There's a real story.
Yeah.
So how does that happen?
It happens because they have a proposed budget. I mean, that's a huge disparity. That's not a common occurrence. You're usually talking about maybe if it's 800, maybe you get to the closing and it's 950 or something like that. That's a whole different, to me, story. And I've dealt with issues like that where we've been able to maybe negotiate a significant credit where it covers you for the next 2 years, for example, for the delta. But the language in the contract generally says that it's a proposed budget, and that might change.
Yeah.
So I think you can always try to factor in something might be a little bit higher. Now, you can also try to negotiate. And again, if you go to a developer and you start throwing in the kitchen sink of the things you want to negotiate, you might not get the contract.
Yes.
But you could say, look, you could cap it at a certain amount, and if it's higher than a certain amount, maybe you get a credit. But that's generally not negotiated.
Generally, the reality is, and I think the thing that's really probably creating the biggest upswing in HOA fees is the insurance situation.
Yes.
The insurance game has meant that the insurance costs, just like buying a house.
Yep.
You buy a house, you factor in or you budget, let's say, insurance of $30,000 for your house. And then the laws change, the insurance company changes their policies and say, you're a higher risk now. Now it's going to be $60,000.
Yep.
That works just like it works for buildings the same way. So we always say be conscious about that. What I like to do is this. I will look at buildings, and if someone comes to me and says, I went to this building, it looks amazing, they're quoting me $1.25, I'm just like, look, you can't run a Range Rover on a thimble of gasoline. Look at what the building's proposing of what they're going to be delivering. There's a restaurant, there's a bar, there's a bowling alley, there's a gym, there's a boxing gym, there's like 25 different things on there. I'm like, this doesn't come for free.
More amenities, higher the budget. But you took the words out of my mouth, is insurance. That's generally what drives the increase in association dues, whether in new construction, pre-construction, or on current buildings. I mean, that's what affects the insurance, and that's a whole nother discussion to have. Going on costs, by the way, and some of the things you can talk about in a contract too is they'll have a list of things that you have to pay for, closing, utility hookup fees, reimbursements, things like that. You can try to get an estimate from the developer ahead of time because you don't want to all of a sudden have an $8,000 fee of closing for FPL, utility, whatever it might be. So you can try to cap that as well, which you're successful with that sometimes you're not.
And within the contracts, and again, going back to this unfortunate story, there's a situation where people say, we're going to have a restaurant, we're going to have a club, we're going to have a club membership that connects you to a club on the beach that you'll get when you move into the building. And then they find out that, no, that we decided not to do that club anymore. So sorry, there's no club membership. And we were going to do a restaurant, but we decided not to, so there's no restaurant. With this in the contract, there is a amount of flexibility. And again, we're not doing this to scare buyers off. It's all about getting into bed with the right developer. There are a lot of promises that can happen with a developer that are not going to be in the contract. And if you take things because you walked into the sales office and you took everything that they said to you literally, you could really, you could lose your shirt.
Yes, that's again why you need a good agent to represent you and an attorney. Listen, developers representatives, and I work with some of them. I know some of them. Some are very good. It's like car salesmen, I guess too, right? I mean, is some are good and some are just trying to get the commission, and they'll tell you things that sound fantastic and will not come to fruition, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, and this, I mean, I think this kind of wraps it up pretty well. This brings up, there's a lot more points that we can go into. And we have these conversations, and I think we'll probably finish and leave this on a comment, a final comment. For those who are looking at pre-construction, hopefully this conversation has given you enough information to realize that there's a lot more to this than meets the eye. And you need to do your due diligence, and you need someone on your side to protect you, because we're talking about millions and millions and millions of dollars. And the agents sometimes involved, they will walk away, they will take their commission, and they wash their hands of it, and there's absolutely no repercussions for them whatsoever. So make sure you have somebody with a good moral compass, has a good relationship with the developer, has a good relationship with a great attorney. This guy knows the law, knows the condos, knows all the subtle nuances that can go on, and make sure that you get what you want at the price you want, and when you get it, is exactly what you thought it would be.
Nothing else to say about that.
Nothing more.
You're 100% right.
All right, awesome.
Absolutely.
Greg, thank you. We'll be talking. I talk to this gentleman every single day, and obviously knows his stuff, and this is why this is so useful. Thank you for watching. Hope this helps. Stay tuned for another episode of the Better Decisions podcast coming soon.